Welcome to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. Our goal is to help you maximize your church's potential. You'll hear from top leaders in children's, student, and family ministry about the principles and practices they use. Now here's your host, Nick Blevins.
Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Welcome to the Family Ministry Podcast. I'm Nick, I'm your host, and in today's episode, I talk with Corinne Noble, and Corinne and I talk about worship for kids. So what's it look like to have worship teams for kids? Do you use tracks or live lyric videos? Corinne actually moved to using live worship in her environment, so we talk about that. We also talk about something that she has done that I've never heard of a church doing before. I've heard them doing it with adults in the main service and things like that, but not with kids. Before we jump into that interview, though, I just want to mention that the Orange Conference is happening in 1 month. So if you're planning on going, you want to register now because tickets are almost sold out. I go to the Orange Conference every year, and I love it. This year, I'm honored and privileged to be able to speak in a breakout with Jim Weidman. Many of you know Jim. He was on this podcast early on, and Jim is just awesome. So it'll be great, and it'll be a lot of fun to be up there with Jim and talk with you all, hopefully. If you're coming, if you are coming, let me know. Hit me up. I'd love to hear from you before we get there, maybe even connect at the conference for sure. That'd be a lot of fun. Speaking of conferences, I got to experience something this weekend. It wasn't much like the Orange Conference, but it was similar to Orange Tour or Live to Serve or something like that, where I got to help work with a bunch of churches and organize a local kind of one-day conference for children's ministry volunteers, where we had a couple main sessions and 24 breakout options over 3 different breakout sessions, designed really to help serve local children's ministry volunteers. So we did it on a Saturday. It was a lot of fun. If you listen to the podcast episode with Andy Needham, Andy does something similar up in the Northeast where he is. And so we did that here. And, there are plenty of other options for that as well. But it was a lot of fun. And I would just say, coming out of there, one thing I would encourage everyone to think about is gathering together with other churches in your area and consider doing a training all together, kind of like we did. What if you all banded together, put together a main session or 2? But I think what's really helpful is having the breakout sessions where people who do what your volunteers do can lead and share what they do, and everybody can learn from each other. It was a lot of fun. A lot of people worked hard to make it happen. I'm so thankful for them. And speaking of kids worship, like we're going to talk about with Corinne, one of the coolest moments was kicking the whole conference off with a children's worship team and some adults leading us kind of in kidmin style, which was really, really cool. And so as you hear Corinne talk about how she, helps lead worship for kids and gets older kids and students involved, I would highly encourage that as well, because that was a lot of fun at Elevate Kidmin, the conference that we had up here, and it's something we do in our church every week, and I can't imagine not doing it. It's great. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and jump into my interview with Corinne Noble. Today I'm joined by Corinne Noble. Corinne, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, how are you?
I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing well as well.
So tell us a little bit about yourself for anyone who's not familiar with you, yourself, your family, and your church.
Yeah, so my name's Corinne. My husband's name is Sean, and I'm the full-time children's pastor at a mid-sized church in the Phoenix area of Arizona called Desert Springs Church. And I've been at my church for just about a little over a year now. And I've been in kids ministry since the 7th grade as a volunteer. So I was a volunteer in kids ministry for many years. And then I went to the University of Valley Forge in PA to get my degree in children's ministry. And that's where I met my husband, Sean. And we've been in full-time kids ministry for the last 5 years.
That's awesome. So you started as a volunteer in 7th grade. Did you know you wanted to do that, in college or as a job at some point as a student, or did you figure that out in college?
Yeah, actually, I was called into kids ministry in the 5th grade. So when I was still a kid, I was about 10 years old. And it was just one of those callings that was very solid. It was reconfirmed to me at different points when I was a teenager as well. But it was just a really strong calling that was on my life from a really young age. And then I went to college just to pursue that degree so that I could get into full-time kids ministry.
That's awesome. Was there anything, this isn't even what we were going to talk about, but that's always intriguing to me because what I think about is who were the 5th graders or 10th graders or whatever in our church who were like you. And was there anything that was said to you that like really, pointed you in that direction? Because it's not something I think the average 5th grader or 10th grader would think.
Exactly.
Maybe one day I want to do that for a job. So did somebody say something to you, or did it work out some other way?
Well, I think the same thing. It's definitely played into just the way that I do ministry, just knowing that, a 5th or 6th grader in your kids' ministry could be the next children's pastor, could be the next lead pastor. So I definitely think about that in the way that I do my ministry. But I think some of the things that shaped that was just having a really solid children's pastor who I looked up to. She was also a female, which probably played into that, just knowing, a female could be a pastor, could be a children's pastor. So I really looked up to her. And I do believe the way that they did in the children's ministry I was involved in, they did a lot of leadership opportunities for 5th and 6th graders to, lead in worship, to, do puppets and drama. And we just had a lot of extended ministry time just towards that older age group, which I think also played a part in my calling from a young age.
That's really cool. That is a good reminder, though, that, sometimes we need to speak that into the lives of kids and students in our church or call that out of them. That's really cool. So we want to talk about in our conversation today something pretty specific, and that's leading worship with kids and what that looks like, what you've done with that. You've done some unique things, something one thing I've never heard of before, but we'll get to that in a little bit. How did you start out leading worship with kids or leading worship for kids, whether as a volunteer or staff?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because in the 7th grade, that was when they started letting me actually serve as a volunteer. As I said, I did some leadership stuff while I was still a kid in 5th and 6th grade. But my first position when I was in the 7th grade that I was actually given was leading kids in worship. And back then, that pretty much looked like me getting on the stage and having the lyric videos behind me and just, doing the motions to the music and, just worshiping, basically being an example on the stage for the kids. And I was, 1 year, 2 years older than some of the older kids in the group. So that's just kind of a unique situation. What I think is really important for people to know and just to understand is when I started doing worship, I was probably extremely awkward and not a very good singer, not a good dancer, but someone just gave me a chance to serve. And that's something that, I just always try to remember as a, full-time leader in kids ministry, just to remember that sometimes we get those younger leaders in who are awkward and they might have a passion for serving, but they're not, very good yet, just to give them that chance to get on the stage and lead, even if they're not the most amazing leader yet. And also that you don't have to be a good singer or dancer to lead kids in worship. And I hear that sometimes, well, I'm not a good singer. Well, that's not what leading kids in worship is really all about. So over the years, obviously, I became much more comfortable with leading kids in worship. And I learned a lot about what works to engage kids in worship. And then I've also, evolved into actually leading other people who are actually leading the kids in worship now.
Let's talk about that journey a little bit, because I think that's where most people are that are listening if they're leading in children's ministry, and part of what they do is help lead worship for kids. And so what did it look like for you to go from stepping into probably your last church and you're maybe doing it yourself a little bit to set the example to building a team to then do it? Can you walk through that a little bit? Maybe I don't know what it looked like here as you moved into this church. It might be a similar thing just over again, but what did it look like to go from doing it to teaching others to do it and and empowering them? Because I do think it's hard sometimes to find volunteers who can do it. Maybe it's because they think they can't, like you said, or who knows what it is. What did that look like for you?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely takes some time to build it. It's not going to look the way you want it to look right away. And I think it definitely always starts, especially in a smaller church, mid-sized church, if it's not already in place when you come in to that leadership position, oftentimes that does fall on you or your husband or, whoever you can just kind of find to do it. So I know in my first, full-time position, it was a much smaller church. And pretty much the entire time I was there, it was just me and, some 5th and 6th grade kids leading kids in worship with lyric videos, and that was great. And that worked for that time. But then when I moved into my next position, for a while, it was me leading kids in worship. And then it was eventually a couple teenagers stepping up and me training those teenagers how to lead the kids into worship. And then we started a 3rd through 5th grade, like upper elementary kids worship team where we would teach the kids how to lead the other kids in worship. And that worked really well for a long time at my last ministry position. And then it was really, and this is really interesting and just unique, the team that I worked with on Sunday mornings and some of them that led worship, just all of a sudden were like, well, why don't we try doing a live worship team in kids ministry? And these were teenagers who just brought up this idea. And we were like, oh, well, that's kind of a cool idea. Like, well, if you guys are willing to do it, we'll, work with you and we'll train you and let's give it a go. And that was really how it was birthed at my last church, was just a group of teenagers wanting to do it and stepping in. And we really had, a smallish live worship team. And, but it was really awesome. And it was just the beginning of that idea of, well, why can't we have live worship in kids? So when we came to our current position, like I said, I've been here for a little over a year. We really wanted to bring that live worship element to, our new ministry position. At first, it was definitely me leading worship again. And I was like, this is not going to last for long because I want to train up other people to do this because this is not, my ministry position anymore. So what we actually did here is we held auditions for our worship team. And, just like our adult worship team would hold auditions or the youth team would hold auditions, we just held auditions on a Sunday afternoon. And from that initial audition time, we got a full team together, a full band, one of each instrument and a couple vocals. And that's just how it got started. And over the last year, we've been able to grow that team to 2 full worship teams that actually rotate. So that's just really neat. And just so so the listeners know, our worship team is very much a mixture. It's a big, diverse group of some upper elementary kids, teenagers, young adults, and also adults. So it's just a very diverse group of people who just want to, help kids learn how to worship. So that's really neat.
So having experienced, both worlds, doing some live lyric or some track based worship and now having a live band, and you've got, I imagine you have some adults in it, but also students and kids. Are there any adults that play instruments or no?
We have a couple of adults who sing, and then we have some young adults who play instruments.
Cool.
It's mostly teenagers, young adults. That's
what I figured. And what would you say you've seen is the difference between the two? Do you definitely prefer the live worship band and instruments and the whole deal? And if so, how come?
Yeah, I would say that there are really some pros and cons to both. Having done both, the lyric video route is a lot easier. There's definitely less concerns for mess ups or hiccups. You don't have to do as many practices as you would for a live worship team. And you really only need a couple people willing to get on the stage and lead. So I would say those are really the pros for doing, lyric video led worship. And that can be very effective on its own. But having moved into the live worship realm, I would say the pros for us really have been just having more of a cohesive worship culture throughout the church. I know in both our previous church and our current church, our youth ministry has a full live worship team, and our adult ministry in the main service has a live worship team. So for the kids to also have that live worship element, it just brings a lot of cohesiveness between all of the ministries. And I believe it really prepares the kids for worship when they move out of the kids ministry into the youth ministry and into the adult ministry. So I think that's really the main thing, is I just think it brings just a cohesiveness. It creates that bridge. And I also just believe that live worship just has a different feel. And it really just engages the kids more than just a video would, having that full team on the stage.
I want to dig into, what does it actually look like in terms of schedules and rehearsal and all that stuff. But before that, what are some key points you have learned that would be helpful for anyone who leads kids in worship? So that could be, and I'm probably thinking more the front person, the lead vocalist, whether it's in a live band or with live lyrics and like a track style, but just the skills of leading kids to worship from the stage. It's not even about the music, I guess, as much, but engaging them and guiding them and all that. Are there some points that you could share, having done it yourself and teaching others to do it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of my things that I've learned really don't require the live worship team element at all. You can do it either way. One thing that I would say just right off the bat, it can be very difficult if, I'm speaking out to people who were maybe like me, who have led worship a long time. You really learn how to engage the kids. You really learn how to bring that energy to the stage. It can be very hard just to get other leaders trained to the level that you really want to release that worship leading position to them. So I will just acknowledge that from the get-go, that, I still have people on the stage who, are younger teenagers, and I just cringe sometimes because I'm like, oh, they're not quite, engaging the kids the way that I would if I was on the stage. But I would just encourage, those who are still like leading in that main position to train other people up to be able to do what they do. So on that note, I would say this is something that I really require, is I expect all of my leaders that are in the room, not just the leaders that are on the stage, to really set the example of worship. This is just really important. I've noticed, like, sometimes in even my kids' ministries, like the leaders that are not on the stage, they tend to want to just hang in the back of the room and chill on their cell phones or, chat amongst themselves.
They're basically fifth grade boys or fourth grade boys.
Right. And that can happen. And once like one or two leaders start doing that, all of your leaders start to do that.
Yeah.
And what I see when that happens is our kids see our leaders not worshiping. And I go, okay, well, how are we going to expect the kids to enter into worship if our leaders that are in the room are not entering into worship? So I really expect all of my leaders to set that example, whether they are leading from the front or they are just out there with the kids, just worshiping. And what I encourage my leaders to do is just spread out among the kids, not stand in the back, because I believe that it's really important that the kids feel like the leaders are worshiping with them, not behind them.
Yeah.
Something I tell my leaders is that you can't lead from behind. So the kids can't see your leaders if they're behind the kids. So I really expect them to be with the kids during the worship time. Another thing is you can use your environment to enhance the worship experience. And this really depends. Everyone has different environments in their kids' ministries, and I totally get that. Some people have more ability to change the lighting and the sound in their room than others. But I do believe that it really helps during worship to bring down the lights, because I even see this with adults. People are self-conscious about worshiping. Even kids are, especially your upper elementary kids. And the less they can see the people around them and the distractions around the room, the more they're going to focus in and they're going to actually engage in worship. So I really bring the lighting down in the room. That's really important. And I also believe that the sound level makes a huge difference. Because if you're in a room and you're trying to worship and the sound is too quiet and you could really hear yourself singing, what do? You stop singing. So I really believe the sound needs to be at a level where the kids are going to have the perception that no one can hear them sing. That doesn't mean blare it at such a loud level that you're going to lose your hearing. But if that sound level is at least high enough that it gives that impression that you can sing and the people around you can't hear you, that you're going to engage more in worship.
Yeah, and that's true for adults too. You totally see that.
Definitely.
Yeah, with adults, and so it makes sense. It's no different with kids.
It really isn't. And I mean, a lot of the things that I've learned are just true across the board with all ages. It's just that, people expect adults to already be at that level. And in some ways, they're really not either.
Totally. In fact, maybe even more so. I don't know. I guess it depends. Because younger kids could be maybe more open to that without the environment being right. But certainly third, fourth, fifth, you get with the older kids, you're right, the environment matters even more.
Yeah, absolutely. Younger kids will jump around and sing to their heart's content, but those older kids are basically just like the adults and the teenagers. They really need that change in environment. This is probably like one of the most important things that I really have worked on with my leaders, and that is just engaging the audience, not just with your actions. Like, it's great that our leaders are, engaging in worship, they're jumping around, they're raising their hands, whatever that looks like. But the kids need to be engaged with your words as well. And this is really applying to that lead worship person on the stage. It's really important that they're engaging the kids with their words, telling the kids to focus in, giving them ideas of ways that they can worship, ways that they can express their worship. When you don't see that, like when someone just gets up and they're just singing, like they're just leading, like you see that the kids don't engage as much. And I've noticed like there's a huge difference when the kids are really led into worship verbally, not just by the actions of the people on the stage. And some of that is just because kids don't really understand, especially like kids who are newer to church, may not really understand what worship is or what in the world we're doing. So it's very important that someone is explaining that to them and giving them ideas of ways they can worship.
Before you go on real quick, I know some curriculums will, like, if you're using a curriculum that has a large group element, they may write something in to help you with that. But if not, do you write your own stuff? Because I know you write your own curriculum, and we could talk about that more in a little bit too. But so do you write those pieces in to help leaders know what to say to get kids, ready?
I don't, because I don't include like a worship element in my curriculum. I don't include like songs and everything. One of the things that I do is I just really coach my leaders. I give them examples, but I really don't want to script it out for them.
Yeah.
I think that that's great that some curriculums actually do that, but I really want it to be authentic. And sometimes that means it's a little messy and the person who's leading says something kind of silly that isn't the best, but that's a learning experience for them. So for me, it's really more about coaching those leaders, giving them ideas, and then kind of setting them free to do what feels right in the moment.
Yeah, and it probably, even if it were in a curriculum, hopefully they're not just reciting it. It really is just, here's the concept, make it work. That's good.
Exactly. So a couple other things that we do that really help with just engaging the kids is we bring our kids out of their seats. So if you have like chairs or easy risers or whatever that looks like in your ministry, we bring our kids out of their seats and up to the front. So we have this big open area in the front that we do our worship time in. And I find that makes a huge difference because when the kids are at their seats, they've got all these distractions around them. They have like whatever they brought with them. They've got candy. They have their friends. And when you bring them out of their seats up to the front, they're able to spread out more. And they're also able to just get away from those distractions, which makes a huge difference.
Do you, and this, I don't know, because, I joked earlier about the 4th and 5th grade boy or whatever, though it's largely common. You'll see that a lot where it's hard to get them to engage. And it might be different when you have a live band like you do. I'm thinking more churches that are doing, live lyrics or tracks or whatever. Do you, because I've heard people have different opinions on this, do you actively try to get them engaged somehow? Like if they're in the back leaning against the wall kind of thing? Because I've heard churches that will not do that because, again, it would give them the freedom. Or it's like you can't lean against the wall. You can totally stand here in the back and not do anything. But, I've seen churches kind of draw, I don't know if boundaries is the right word, but approach that differently in terms of how much they really want to try to get them engaged or not. Do you do something specific there? Or, what does that look like for you?
It's a fine line. You never want to force anyone into worship. Obviously, our goal is leading kids into authentic worship. And if you're having to force them, that's not, the goal of what we're doing. What we do in bringing the kids out of the seats is we do actually require all of the kids to come to the front of the room, and we do require them to at least stand at the front of the room. We're not going to force them to do to jump around. We're not going to force them to sing, but we are going to expect them to come up to the front, and stand at the front. I think that that's a level of expectation that is okay, and it's not forcing anyone into anything. It's really more just giving them the opportunity to worship,
Yeah. And I've seen that's basically our approach. That's what I've heard others do too. I think it is a good balance because you're right. You can't force them, but at the same time, it doesn't help if they're leaning on the back wall because more of them will do that. So like that in between of like, no, you have to be here and you have to stand, but you don't have to participate. I think that is probably the best way to go.
And I think that having the leaders kind of intersperse, also participating, especially if you have any male leaders, getting them to participate like with those boys, that makes a big difference.
True.
As well.
That is huge.
And I know sometimes finding, male kids ministry leaders can be tough. I know it is in my church, but having those male leaders who are willing to get in there and participate and just show the kids that, worship is for, all genders and all ages, I think also makes a difference.
Cool. Any other tips before we jump in and kind of dig into like what it looks like at your church in terms of the schedules and the teams and all that stuff?
Yeah, I would say one more thing just about music in general. I know like worship is about more than music, but obviously the main way that we do experience worship in our services is through music. So I think choosing your music intentionally is really important. We really don't do a lot of kid-specific worship music. I'm not like completely against it. So for those of you who use that, that's completely up to you. But for us, we really try to use a lot of music that either like our youth worship team uses in youth ministry, or our adult ministry uses in the main service. Again, that kind of goes back to just creating a cohesive worship culture. We don't use all the same music that they use, but we do try to include some of the same songs. That way, if, the kids are an adult, in an adult service, in the worship service, they're going to know some of the music. If they move up to youth ministry, when they graduate out of kids ministry, they're already going to be familiar with the worship style. So we're really intentional in that we try to use some of the same music. We try to use songs that don't have a lot of like imagery. So if a song has a lot of like imagery that kids wouldn't understand, if we do use it, we're going to explain that when we're leading the kids verbally from the stage. So just being intentional about the kind of music that you use, and repeating music a lot. That's something that you might not see it over in like the main service, but for kids, like the more they know the music, the more likely they are to take their eyes off the screen, close their eyes, and really focus in on worshiping.
Yeah, we've seen a benefit too when kids are doing songs their parents know the same song or whatever. Then they can hear it together, listen to it in the car together. That is a big thing. Songs
that are on the radio, that's, they're already familiar with it. You don't have to teach it to them. They already know it.
Yep. So what is now we're at your church now, you have these two bands that rotate. So it sounds like they're doing every other week. Or do you have multiple services? Like, are they doing both services? Like, what does it look like practically in terms of the schedule, the teams, the practice?
Yeah. So, like I said, we've built up to that 2 teams that rotate. What we've done is we've done one team on for a month and then the other team on for the next month, kind of rotating months. But we've also done every other week, and both have worked really well. It just kind of depends on, what kind of works for your team, what level of commitment works for them. We do have 2 services every week, and we do require the same worship team to do both services, which can be like a big requirement. I get that. But that's also the requirement over, in our worship services in the main service, is that it's the same team for both services. And one of the ways that we make that a little bit more convenient and doable for people so that they can still attend services, as obviously that's like a big concern, is we really place our worship strategically after the worship in the main service and before our lead pastor's message in the main service. So basically it's like right in the middle of our service, which is a little different than, I think most people are used to. They're used to like worship being kind of on the front end, but it really works really well for us because we're able to use some of the same people that the main service uses. Sometimes we have some crossover on some of our worship team members. And then they're also able to get back in and hear the lead pastor's message, so they're not missing the entire service. So that's something that we've done to make that a little bit more convenient, a little bit more doable for our teams.
Do you have to do you ever run into scheduling issues, but timing issues where it's like, they're not done yet and you're ready for
Absolutely.
them? Yeah. Okay. That's what I figured.
Yeah, so that definitely happens. So we're very flexible in that. Most of the time we've kind of figured out what that timing looks like. We've put enough things at the front end that the worship team will be ready to go. But occasionally, like this Sunday is a great example. We have communion once a month. And usually when we have communion, the worship service portion of our main service actually goes a little bit longer. So when that happens, what we'll do is we'll usually move a couple more things to the front end of the service before worship, just to give that time for that worship team to get in place. So yeah, it definitely does complicate things. That's why I was saying there's definitely pros and cons to using a live worship team. But we obviously believe that it's worthwhile. So we keep doing it.
Yeah, and you could keep growing it too, where you get more teams, and that would probably solve some of the scheduling things. What does rehearsal look like, especially with the month on, month off? Or maybe what did it look like with both, when it was every other week or month on, month off?
So basically, if someone's on for that month, they, and that's if it's every other week or they're just going to take the whole month. We have one practice a month that's an extended worship practice. It's about, 2 to 3 hours. And they'll practice all the songs that they're going to do for the month. One thing we do, again, with just repeating music, we use the same slower worship song all month long. So then it's only one song that the team has to learn, and it's also only one song that the kids have to learn. And we found that really helps. So we have that one extended worship practice once a month following our 2 services on a Sunday afternoon, and we provide lunch for the team and everything. And then we have more of a sound check kind of mini worship practice for about 15 to 30 minutes before our first service every week.
Okay, so you're doing it before the service every week. Which is great.
That's more of just a sound check. We run the 3 songs we're going to do, one time through, and then we're good to go.
And was it different before with a different schedule, or did you still do a once a month extended rehearsal and then run through before?
Yeah, it's always been that way. For instance, I know our main worship team does do an extended practice every week, and so does our youth worship team. And we've just found, at our church, to add another every week extended worship practice just isn't doable for people. So
sure. Now, at this point, do you lead those teams yourself? Are you the one kind of coordinating and schedules and emailing and all that? Or is there somebody else you've empowered to kind of lead the charge with it?
Yeah. So right now, my husband actually kind of coordinates that and leads those teams. But we're in the process of, as many people are, we're in the process of empowering those leaders that are on the team that we're seeing emerge to really take that on and, and run that team without us. So, my husband still kind of coordinates the practices and everything, but there are times when he's not on the stage and they completely do it by themselves. And really the goal is to get them just empowered to run it all on their own.
Yeah, which is, it's great. And they're probably, like you said, getting there. And this has only been a year. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
This church currently is. So that is pretty fast for anybody who's listening. They could probably realize that, like you said before, it takes time, which is important to know.
It takes time, and it's always growing. We have new people added to the team almost every month, which is really neat. But that's also, just the challenge of getting them trained up to the level that they need to be at. So it's always growing and it's always changing.
So you do something I've never heard of before, though it's not, I don't know, completely foreign, but because it's something you see a lot for adults or even church-wide or whatever. But you have kids worship nights. What are those, and how do they work? How often do you do them? What do they look like? What's the benefit? All that. I'd love to hear about how that got started and why you do it.
Yeah, kids worship nights have really become one of my favorite events to do for kids. It was something. I really can't put my finger on the moment or the reason why I thought of doing kids worship nights, but the idea did come to me at my previous church, probably about 3 years ago. And, I just was like, one day I was like, why don't we do kids worship nights? Like you were saying, adults have them, and it's like, why don't we do it? And obviously, like an adult worship night, if anyone's ever been to one of those, they tend to be just like an hour and a half of straight music, which is obviously not going to work for most kids.
Yeah.
So our kids worship nights do not look exactly like an adult worship night, just due to attention spans and everything. But it's just been a really cool thing that's really developed. When we first started doing it, it was all like, lyric videos and that. And then we kind of moved to being able to do like some of the worship just, with like a keyboard and a guitar. And then, our most recent one, we've moved to doing it full live worship, which is really neat. But one of the reasons why we started doing it was just realizing that there's just not enough time on Sunday mornings for having that extended time of worship or teaching the kids about worship. Because as I was saying before, many kids don't really understand worship. They don't understand what we're doing, why we do it, or even like, well, how do I worship, And I was noticing that, I was looking around and like, the kids are really not engaging in worship. And why is that? And I realized, well, we're not really spending that time teaching them about worship and giving them the time to really enter in on a Sunday morning. So that's where kids worship nights came in. They're really just all about worship. We teach on worship because that's really, really important. In fact, I always say like the teaching time is actually more important than the actual worship time, because if we don't teach kids about worship, they aren't going to be able to authentically enter in because they don't understand it. So we teach on it. We have extended worship and altar time, very similar to what you would have at like a camp service, which, is really great, but that's once a year. And we really want to have that more often. We also do some small groups times, which is really great for kids to bring up like those honest questions about worship. If they still don't understand something, they're able to bring that up in a small group that's age, appropriate. We break them up into like younger kids and older kids, and that really makes a difference as well. And we do some small group activities, like just really weird stuff. Like we let the kids one time go outside and just draw with chalk on the ground what worship meant to them. And just a really cool testimony, kind of bunny trailing, but I was like, well, we're going to do this. Maybe the kids are just going to mess around. And a kid like literally drew a vision from the Lord in chalk on the sidewalk while we were doing this small group activity. So, don't underestimate just those different ways to worship. Worship isn't just singing. Kids can worship through different ways, like through art, through drawing, through writing. So just kind of teaching kids that worship is about more than just singing is also something that we do at worship nights. But really, it's just about giving the kids that opportunity to learn about worship and also have a fresh experience with God through worship. So I know people might be wondering, well, how often do we do this? The goal is really to have a kids worship night about 2 to 4 times a year. I think ideally being able to do it once a quarter is really great, because you're able to just have that extended time. You're able to teach the kids. And it's very similar to a camp experience, but not once a year. And it's really neat.
And I imagine it's the same bands, just maybe a mix up, whoever can do it for that one, and you pull them together. So is it parents and kids, or kids by themselves?
So it's specifically done towards kids. Obviously, parents are always welcome. We don't do it specifically as a family worship night. We do it as a kids worship night aimed towards kids. Although I have been considering doing a family worship night in the future. I have not done it yet, but I have been considering offering that as well.
Cool. Is there anything else, about that you'd want to share, or, let people know that's worked, or, they might be interested in that I'm not asking about, in case there's something I'm missing?
Yeah. I think one of the benefits that you might not realize going into just doing a kids worship night is that your leaders that come to worship night, I've noticed that the leaders are just so inspired, and also I would say, even to use the word, shocked by the fact that kids can really enter into worship. And I've seen that at every worship night I've done, no matter if it was live worship or it was lyric video led. I've seen kids entering into worship in just a new and unique way. And I've had leaders come to me and they're just like, wow, I just didn't know that kids could experience God in such a strong way at such a young age. And that's been just a really unique thing, as well as the kids going home and telling their parents about what they experienced, and their parents realizing that their kids can really experience God. So that's a huge benefit of doing these kids worship nights. And I know there's a lot of details that go into planning these, and I've actually shared a lot of those details on my website. So if anyone's interested, they can check that out there as well. Yeah,
we'll link to that. That'll be good because you have multiple posts about that, so they can dig into some of those details even more.
Yes, absolutely.
Something else that I want to touch on, even though we're not kind of talking through it today, is you write your own curriculum and you started to share it as well, right, for free on your site. So if you could just tell us a little bit about that. How do they get it? What does it look like in terms of how long is a typical curriculum for, that kind of thing?
Yeah. So it's something I've started doing pretty recently. Back in the summer, I started writing my own curriculum. It was really just a kind of a one-time fluke, like I'll just write to go along with the main service. And, I really, came to love it and love having that freedom. And so I started writing my own curriculum all the time. And one thing I just talked with my lead pastor about was just being able to share that out with anyone for free, because I believe that there's a lot of people out there who maybe can't afford to buy curriculum, or maybe they just want to use something different. And I just want to be able to provide it to them and offer that resource. So when I first started writing, it was a little bit, smaller of a curriculum, more of like your basic large group elements, like, a game, skit, message, object lesson, some review questions, that type of thing. But as I've been writing, we've really grown it to having, a small group element, adding additional games, adding additional discussion questions. And it's just been really neat to be able to provide that resource for our ministry, but also for other ministries. So I also on the blog, I blog about the set designs that we do to go along with the curriculum, and have Pinterest boards that go along with the curriculum as well.
That's awesome. And that's all at kidmincorinne.com. And we'll link to that as well, but it's basically just like it sounds, right? So they can check that out there. How else can people connect with you if they have any questions or want to follow up?
Well, I'm on all of the normal social media. So I'm on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And my name is Kidmin Corinne on all of those different social media sites. And I'd love to hear from anyone who has questions about kids worship or kids worship nights. I'm always willing to share literally anything that I have, notes, old messages, anything that can help people with, engaging their kids in worship and in their ministry.
Awesome. Well, this has been really helpful. Thanks for sharing this, and especially all of it, but especially even the kids worship night thing that I think is pretty rare, pretty unique. So that's kind of cool. And I'm sure people want to, ask about that and see if that's something they want to do in their church. So thanks for coming on the podcast and sharing this with us.
Thank you for having me.
A kids worship night is something I've never heard of before. I don't know about you, but that was new. I think that's pretty intriguing, kind of an interesting idea. You could even consider using it as a way to partner with parents. Corinne mentioned how that, isn't exactly their strategy and their approach, but that could be something you could consider. Here are a couple action items you could take coming out of this interview. One would be to evaluate your kids' worship. Get a few folks involved and evaluate what you do now. Maybe consider different options, live music, video only, tracks, whatever it might be. Something else you could consider is taking the idea of a kids' worship night to a team and discussing that. Is that something that you want to try in your church? And then, like I mentioned in the beginning, I think anytime you can get older kids or certainly middle school or high school students involved in leading kids' worship, it's a win. So if that's not happening now, I think you should consider starting a team for kids and student worship leaders, to help get up there in front of kids and lead them every week. That would be huge for them. Kids love it, obviously. They're like rock stars. Students are. They're like rock stars to those kids. So all the show notes and everything we talked about can be found at nickblevins.com/episode 45. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you hear it every week. Next episode, next week, I talk with Aaron Jack Bauer, actually, to be specific, which is fun. We talk about his name there. And we talk about self-leadership, like how Aaron leads himself, and aligning your next-gen team. So if you are a next-gen pastor or you serve, as a children's pastor or a student pastor, and you want to see your team work together as one team, Aaron kind of talks through what that process has been like for his team over the last 2.5 years, I think. So you don't want to miss that. Be sure to subscribe, and we'll see you in the next episode of the Family Ministry Podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Nick Blevins Family Ministry Podcast. We hope this helps you maximize your church's potential. We would love to hear stories of how you apply what you've learned. You can do that by leaving a comment on iTunes or in the show notes at nickblevins.com.